welcome to International Forum. Today our program is about America in the world post 9/11. I am pleased and honored to have as my guest Dean Anne-Marie Slaughter, a leading scholar of international law and international relations, author, commentator, educator. She's the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, where she's also the Bert G. Kestetter Professor of Politics and International Affairs. She's former president of the American Society of International Law and a member of the Board of Council of Foreign Relations and a member of the American Society of Arts and Sciences. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest, Dean Anne-Marie Slaughter.
Thank you.
Welcome.
It's a pleasure.
You have written a book, hot off the press, The Idea That Is America, Keeping Faith with Our Values in a Dangerous World. The book is about post 9/11 America. It's very powerfully written, moving and persuasive, and you have great reviews by prominent Americans like Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's National Security Advisor, and former Secretaries of State Madeleine Albright and George Shultz, and fellow authors and commentators like Fareed Zakaria. Tell us about the book's main theme.
So the book is really an effort to answer what role America should play in the world. I have a very strong sense that America's lost its way in the world, and that for the first time in my lifetime, and really the worst time in American history, we're more than disliked in the world. We are seen as having betrayed our principles. We are seen as no longer standing for the things that Americans think we stand for liberty and democracy and justice, but instead for being hypocrites, that we talk about justice, but we have detainees in Guantanamo who have no rights. We refuse to abide by the Geneva Conventions. We talk about equality, but we don't give other nations a voice in what happens to them. So this is a book that tries to discuss true American values based on our history, and to say, if we believe in these values, if we believe in liberty and democracy and equality and justice and tolerance and humility and faith, then this is what our foreign policy should look like.
I'd like to just share with our viewers a paragraph or two in your book, which I find so deeply moving because it's something that comes from the heart and deep within your soul. You wrote, "I grew up believing that ours was a country that tried to stand for good in the world and that upheld the fundamental values that bind us together as a nation. When I read the papers in the morning, I often feel that I'm in a bad dream. American soldiers and Iraqi civilians are dying daily in Iraq, in a war we rushed into under false pretenses and now can't get out of. We are so hated in many parts of the world that any policy initiative with our name on it is dead on arrival. Even the citizens of our fellow democracies see us as morally bankrupt, and not without reason." Question, how did things go so badly wrong? How did we get to where we are today?
Well, the first thing to note is they've been going wrong for a while, because even in the Clinton administration, around 1997, after we refused to vote for the International Criminal Court, my friends in Britain, and of course Britain is our oldest, it's not our oldest ally, but it's certainly one of our closest allies, even people in Britain said to me, "What is happening in your country? You know, you voted against a court that is supposed to bring people who perpetrate genocide and crimes against humanity and grave and systematic war crimes to justice." And so even by the end of the Clinton administration, there was this sense on the part of other countries that we were somehow above the law, that we made our own rules, that we said we are the greatest power on earth and we don't have to play by the same rules as everyone else. All of that got much, much worse after 9/11, and specifically with the Bush administration's reaction to 9/11. Because, of course, immediately after 9/11, the world was with us. People around the world, even if they'd been angry at us, wrote all of us, sent us emails, stood with us. Le Monde said we are all Americans now. And then we just ignored the world. We told NATO that we didn't necessarily want them to go with us in Afghanistan. We ignored what the rest of the world said in going into Iraq. And we announced that we didn't need anybody else, and we knew better than everyone else. And of course, the result has been disastrous. It's been disastrous in Iraq. Even in Afghanistan, we are once again in a situation where we could well be losing. And we've essentially, we declared that we knew better than anyone else, and like all the heroes in the Greek myths decided they knew better than the gods, we are now having our comeuppance. And the sad thing is that many nations are watching us and saying, we told you so, or they're saying you deserve it. And that's not what our country's about. It's not what we stand for.
Yeah. But the Americans seem to think that that's not how we are, that's not how we behave. You wrote about this Pew survey,
yes,
in 2005 that says that 67% of Americans do think that we listen to other countries when we make policy.
Right.
So
there's clearly a great deal that is lost in translation. if you think that Americans have an image of what we stand for in the world and what we do, and they think we try to do good. And I think most Americans, our soldiers, most Americans across the country really do want to do good in the world. But at the same time, we are represented in the world by an administration that has made absolutely clear that they don't care what other countries think. Secretary of State Rice and now Secretary of Defense Gates, I think, want to put us on a better path. But they are in an administration where the vice president above all and the president periodically have just essentially told other countries that we know best and we don't need them, won't listen to them, and anybody who contradicts us or criticizes us is unpatriotic. Or remember, you're either with us or you're against us. Well, that means even our friends who want to tell us, look, you're going wrong, do this, we will help you, they get told, you criticize us, you're against us. Just like Americans, like me, people who love our country but who say we're going wrong, are told we're unpatriotic. I wanted to write a book that said, the greatest patriots in our history have been those people who have said to our government, hey, you have to live up to your word. You have to deliver on your promises. You are going wrong, and it is our duty as Americans to put you on the right track.
That's an important point to make. In the context of what has happened, what role should America play in the world going forward?
Well, we have to start, but with a dose of humility. Today, we've just seen Memorial Day celebrations, and one of the things I point out is that the people in our history who have been the most humble have been our generals and our presidents, until this one, who have fought wars. So if you go back to Eisenhower, for instance, he said, anyone who has seen the sacrifice and the blood of his friends has got to be humble, has got to understand humility, because it's something so much larger than we are. Or Roosevelt, after World War II, talking about our humility as a nation in the face of the sacrifice of our soldiers. Or Lincoln, or Washington. These are people who understood that they were small parts of something much larger. Our country has got to turn to the world and say, we made some real big mistakes. We were wrong in Iraq. We thought there were weapons of mass destruction. There weren't. We thought we knew how to do it. We thought we could build democracy. We were wrong. We made major mistakes. But we're now going to try to fix those mistakes and to work with other nations to put ourselves back on track. That's the first thing we have to do, because just as we tell our children, or we tell people whom we admire but we think are going wrong, you have to own up when you've made a mistake. And then you go forward on that basis. And that's the first thing this country has to do. And then this country has to work with many other nations and listen to them, not apologize, not grovel, but listen to them and work with them to develop common policies that will get us out of this mess.
You call for us to return to our values, the values that define this country as a nation. Standing for those values, you say, is both an end and a means, because it reflects who we are as a people. It also serves our long-term national interest. Tell us about these values that you write passionately, convincingly about, that we need to return to in your book.
So the values that I discuss are liberty and democracy and equality and justice. And I say, if you took a random sample of Americans and you woke them up in the middle of the night and said, what does America stand for? You'd certainly get probably 3 of those 4. They'd come up with liberty and justice for all. True. They would talk about democracy. They would talk about all men are created equal. So they'd get those 4. But then I also talk about tolerance, which was a critical value for us becoming a nation with all the different religious groups learning how to live together. I talk about humility, which, again, I think if you go through our history, you will see it's been a very important value. Governor Winthrop, when he gave his speech to the Puritans on the ship on the Mayflower, he said, we shall be as a city on a hill, which everybody knows about. But at the end, then he said, but if we don't live up to our values, we shall be shipwrecked among nations. He said, all the eyes of the world are upon us. But what he meant was they're looking to us to live up to our values, and if we fail, they will denounce us. And then he said at the end, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with thy God. And the last value I talk about is faith. And what I argue is that these are our values, these are our ideals, these are the things we look up to. But this isn't an idealistic message. I'm not writing a book that says, gee, you know, even though we face a lot of threats, we should just cling to our ideals. I argue that it's in our interest to live up to our ideals, because standing for our ideals is a key part of our power. It's very interesting. If you go back and you read about Al-Qaeda, one of the things you read about is that Arabs, after World War II, saw the United States as standing for values of liberty and democracy and equality. These were important values to any nation fighting against colonialism. And that was a source of attraction for them. They looked to the United States. They didn't hate the United States. They saw us as standing for things they wanted. And my argument is that in our history and today, living up to our values, or trying to live up to our values, is as much a part of our power as a big army, and that we need both. When we can't just trust to living up to our values. We face real threats. But when we build our military, when we promote democracy, when we operate in international institutions, when we try to persuade other nations to do what we want, having moral capital, standing for a set of values, is a key part of our power.
But are these values unique to America? Don't many other countries have some or even all of these same values?
Yes. And many people have said, well, what you're doing is arguing for American exceptionalism. This is just one more American saying, we are unique in the world, we are exceptional. I argue directly against that. Our founders believed in universal values. If you go back to the Declaration of Independence, it doesn't say, you know, we Americans believe these truths to be self-evident. It says, we believe these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and all men are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I, of course, would add all men and women, all humans. But what they meant was all people are entitled to these things, and all people share these values if they're given a chance to. And we Americans are going to try to live up to them to prove that governments can, in fact, be based on these values. But they're not American values. They are Japanese values, they're English values, they're German values, they are Indonesian or Korean or Taiwanese. They are values that any people anywhere in the world, Botswana is another good example, can stand for. And America has to recognize that we are one nation playing our role in trying with other nations to create a world that stands for universal values, or that lives up to universal values?
I can't help but feel that I need to ask you this question. The very people, they have a name, the neocons of this country, they profess to have the same values, but the outcome of the execution, implementation of their values is the Iraq War and the mess and the whole mess that we find ourselves in today. So how do you practice your values so that the outcomes are good for the good of the world and good for America?
Well, so that goes back to your earlier question about means and ends. Where I agree with the neocons is that we must have a foreign policy that is based on our values. So they and I would both talk to people who think, no, we should be realists, we should base American foreign policy on power and interest alone, and if a government abuses its own people terribly, we should just ignore that, because what matters is where they are in the power calculus. I disagree with that. I do think America has to have a policy based on values, that if a government's a democracy or a dictatorship, it matters. But where we disagree radically is on means, because they think that the means we should employ are unilateral and military, that we should disregard what other nations think and stand for what they think is right, and we should use our military as our principal tool. I think the only way we can stand for our values is to have a policy consistent with those values. So if you believe in democracy, then you have to listen to the voices of other people in the world. And if you believe in liberty, you better understand that there are multiple ways to achieve liberty. And trying to impose liberty through an occupation is probably not going to work. And if you believe in justice, well, then you'd better believe in justice for detainees and alleged terrorists just as much as you do for criminals in this country. So my view is we need multilateral policies. I also think America can't be the global policeman, and the only way we're going to actually achieve what we need to achieve is to work with other nations. We do need a strong military, but it's one tool among many, and it frankly should be a tool we use with great reluctance. Restraint, absolutely. The idea that we are sending other people's sons and daughters, in your case, your son, and we're ordering them into war without looking at all the other ways we could achieve our objectives and without recognizing the precious value of those lives and thus our obligation to send them to war only when we have to and only when we know that they can actually achieve their mission, is a key difference between what I advocate and what the neocons advocate. And unfortunately, they've talked about our values, and Americans have responded to that.
Yes.
But they haven't been honest about the means they're using, and they haven't been smart about the means they're using, which is why I think we need a bipartisan foreign policy based on our values that reaches out to the rest of the world and uses a whole array of means: diplomacy, alliances, letting other countries do things instead of us, keeping our military and using them when we have to, but not as our first instrument.
Yeah, so this is what you mean by the paradigm shift that we desperately need in our foreign policy.
Yes.
In your book. So in that vein, I wanted to ask you what, well, actually, no. This is a different question. While America has been preoccupied with Iraq and Afghanistan, what new geopolitical developments, formation of alliances, etc., do you see that has happened in the last 5 years?
Huge. And one of the things that I argue in this book and also in the Princeton Project on National Security, which I co-directed with John Eikenberry over the last 3 years, is we have been single-mindedly focused on the war on terror, and we've been fighting it where it should be fought, in Afghanistan, and we've been fighting it where we had no need to fight it, at least initially, in Iraq. But meantime, of course, we've seen nuclear proliferation in North Korea and now in Iran. We have seen the rise of a whole set of threats that we're not prepared to deal with, from climate change to global epidemics. We've ignored the larger Middle East, so we haven't been looking at Israel and Palestine. We haven't been paying enough attention to Shia, Sunni splits in other countries. And above all, we have ignored all the things we need to do to integrate rising powers. So China, to begin with, and India. When King Abdullah became king of Saudi Arabia in 2005, he took 4 trips, 1 to the United States. The other 3 were to China, India, and Malaysia. The Middle East is looking east, right? The old Silk Road is coming again. So increasingly now, Africa, Middle East, all the way over to India and then to China. Huge trade routes, huge investment routes. That's a whole part of the world that is building alliances, building ties, building economic exchanges, ignoring us, and we're not paying any attention. When our business is working there, but our government is not at all thinking about how we should be working with India or with various African countries to build our own ties, with the result that in another 10 years you could see China and India and the Middle East and the EU in this huge economic bloc and increasingly important political bloc, with the United States quite isolated, not reaching out to Canada and Mexico, which is one thing we need to be doing for energy and economic reasons, not reaching to the EU, not building our own ties to India, to Japan, to Australia, to the other liberal democracies in Asia, to build a set of alliances and institutions that guarantee that we are still the power we need to be, rather than the militarist power that does nothing but focus on where's the next war.
Something comes to mind, a remark made by a Chinese scholar visiting at the university who said, you know, China was hoping and praying that America will stay preoccupied with Iraq.
Yeah, I bet.
Because then we can they'll leave us alone more.
Absolutely.
So today, what do you think are the greatest national security threats or threats to America's interests, in addition to all the ones you mentioned just now?
Well, so let me start, though, with a comment on China, which you said, which I think is very well taken. China is practicing the policy that the United States practiced after 1945, in the sense it's building institutions, it's working on alliances, it's building economic ties as much as it can. It's exactly what we did with the World Bank and the IMF, with the Marshall Plan, with then the Alliance for Progress later, looking at Latin America. China is doing all that, and we've become the power that is focused mostly on the military, and we need to once again return to that. But I see our biggest threats are the implosion of the whole Middle East, to start with, because if Iraq spreads, or independently, if you can't get peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and that conflict continues, conflict in Lebanon, conflict with Syria through Lebanon, then you have the Iraq war turning into complete chaos, so that you have civil war in Iraq and the Iranians there, the Saudis, the Turks worrying about the Kurds. You could have a
possible fragmentation of Iraq
into
3 countries.
Exactly. You could have a conflagration, a Balkans-type conflagration through the entire Middle East, which would, of course, cripple the global economy. Because as much as we want to wean our dependence from oil, most of our oil is still coming from the Middle East, and something like that would completely cripple the global economy, and it would suck different powers in, right? It could spill then to Pakistan, when Afghanistan, it would have, Russia would probably
become really important.
Absolutely. Russia's energy sources are critical, but Russia itself, who has no love lost for the United States right now, could find ways to keep us so tied down in the Middle East for a decade that we could do nothing else. So that's a huge threat. Then, of course, there are terrorist networks. There are the nuclear proliferation, as I said. There are the global epidemics. There's climate change. I think energy security is an enormous threat. That it's not just that we need to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. It's that China and India and we and Europe and Russia are all scrambling for energy Russia has energy now, but it increasingly is going to be exporting that energy, using that geopolitically in ways that can be quite damaging to our interests. Same thing in Latin America when you look at Venezuela vis-a-vis other countries. We ought to be focusing on building alliances to develop secure energy supplies for the next 20 to 30 years.
Are we doing that?
No, not nearly with the priority that we should be. If we were, we would be first of all thinking about how to build a North American energy community with Canada and Mexico, both of which have oil.
That's right.
We would then be reaching to the EU and saying, look, you've got some oil, you've also got possibilities of developing alternative sources of energy. We'll work with you. We'll build a larger energy community. We would then look to other countries in Latin America and Africa. We'd be building a kind of like an organization, like a Marshall Plan, but thinking about how do we reach out to other countries and build an energy community. We're not doing any of that.
And do you think there should be closer cooperation working with the EU?
Yes, much more. When the U.S. and the EU, and I would say not just the U.S., I would think about Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, because we need to strengthen Mexican democracy. When North America and the EU work together, the potential is unbelievable, because if it's North America, we have tremendous strength in Latin America. The EU has great ties to Africa, and if we're together, we can engage Asia in a very different way. Not as a hostile. I don't mean divide the world as Asia on the one hand and North America on the other. I think the North America is positioned perfectly between our allies in Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, all the Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, those countries, us and the EU. Then we can engage China, and we can work with India, and we can work with the other rising powers.
You're an educator. As dean of one of the most distinguished schools of public and international affairs at one of the most prominent universities in America or in the world, what is your sense of the students that you teach and train? Do you have the sense that they are this crop of young people coming on the scene? They're more willing and more able to do better by America, by our world,
I think
than
so.
their parents' generation, who really, didn't do so well.
I think so. One of the ways you can tell is how anxious they are to study languages. So, for instance, Princeton has more incoming freshmen who want to study Mandarin Chinese than they can handle. It's just exploding. And Arabic and Hindi, these are kids who want to learn the languages of the world more than at any time in America's history. That tells you something. It tells you that they understand that they're going to live and work in a globalized world. And it's not enough to say, everybody will speak English. Why should we bother learning another language? Everybody can come to the United States. They get it. They understand that to compete, they're going to have to be able to operate in Europe and in Asia. They're going to have to be able to speak at least one other language, and preferably more. They're going to have to spend time learning other cultures. And that will be the secret to American success, to their individual success, and to their country's success.
Are they also more open-minded, more humble?
I think so. I think very much so. I think it's interesting. They're very patriotic. And in one way, this book is also written for them. And I actually say in my acknowledgments that I wrote this book above all for the next generation, for my children. I want my children to be able to hold their head high as Americans. I was half Belgian. I grew up going back and forth between Europe and the United States, and I didn't think my country was perfect. My Belgian relatives were always telling me that, we had racism and we fought a terrible war in Vietnam, and I knew that my country was not perfect. But I was proud to be an American, and I want my children and my nieces and my nephews and my students to be American and to be proud of it, not to think that they're better than anybody else, but to feel that they stand for good. So I think the next generation are deeply patriotic after 9/11. They love their country, but they also know that things are going very wrong in their world, and they want to be part of making things right again.
You're on your way to a grand book tour to introduce your book to the country.
Indeed.
which the reviewers say that every American citizen should read.
I hope so.
So best wishes to you, and thank you very much
Thank you.
for being our guest.
Thank you.
Very honored.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Our guest today is Dean Anne Marie Slaughter of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs of Princeton University. Thank you for being with us. I'm May Chang for International Forum. See you next time.